And within just a few minutes, we started seeing clusters of human skeletal material. We were really walking on clouds. I mean, it just unbelievable. It exceeded our expectation. In Central and South Florida, people were bringing their dead back to central locations.
There are ancient bog mummies in Florida, 8,000 years old, preserved so perfectly their brains were still inside their skulls. That alone should have been the headline. But when scientists extracted DNA from those brains, they didn't find what they expected. They didn't find a mystery they couldn't solve. They found something far more unsettling.
What we found is that in many instances, they had nearly the identical sequence or the identical sequence that spanned the full 1,300 years of this site.
An answer that made complete, undeniable sense and yet contradicted nearly everything on record about who first lived in this country, how long they had been here, and what kind of society they had already built. The DNA secret was real, and it is deeply strange. The skull in the water. Steve Vanderjack was not looking for history. He was clearing ground for a housing development in Brevard County, Florida, a job like any other. The pond was black, shallow, unremarkable. Nobody had ever given it a second thought. Then his bucket caught something, and he climbed down to look. The object was round, dark brown, and he took it for a rock at first. Rocks are genuinely uncommon in that part of Florida, which is why he picked it up. He turned it over. It was looking back at him. He called the police. A coroner examined the skull and noted immediately that the bone was stained dark throughout, saturated by prolonged immersion in peat. They were clearly American Indians. There was 8,000-year-old DNA. There was DNA that we could rescue and analyze genetically. This wasn't a recent death. This wasn't a police matter. An archaeologist was needed. Glenn Doran was a young assistant professor at Florida State University, specializing in human skeletal remains. He had been in the field long enough to manage his expectations. He drove out to Brevard County, expecting very little. A small, dark, uninviting pond ringed by scrubland. He walked the perimeter anyway, because that is what you do. Within minutes, he was crouching over clusters of human skeletal material eroding out of the peat banks. Then 4 more skulls, then the teeth. And here is where it started getting strange. The wear patterns on those teeth were extreme. Not from eating, from gripping, from using teeth the way we use tools. Modern people don't produce wear like that. Doran knew, before a single lab result came back, that he was looking at something from deep prehistory. Radiocarbon dating confirmed it. Between 7,000 and 8,000 years old, 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, 3,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid was laid, 2,000 years before Stonehenge. Doran would later say his team felt like they were walking on clouds. They had expected old. They had not expected this, and the pond hadn't even shown them what was underneath yet. There was a relatively small, little, nasty, water-black pond, and at first glance, it didn't look like a particularly inviting place for an archaeological site. The problem here is the immediate crisis nobody outside the field talks about. The remains were still underwater. The bog held millions of gallons, and anything excavated without controlled conditions would begin degrading within hours of hitting open air. Ancient organic material sealed in an anoxic environment for millennia starts to fall apart the second oxygen reaches it. The team had just found something extraordinary and was now staring down the real possibility of destroying it in the process of getting it out. It took 2 years to solve that problem. 150 well points were sunk into the peat around the perimeter of the pond. Pumps ran around the clock. 700 gallons of water per minute drained continuously until the floor of the bog came into view. Stay with me here, because what the team saw when they stepped onto that exposed sediment for the first time was not what anyone had prepared for. The handful of skulls found by accident were not anomalies. They were the surface of something far larger. Body after body came out of the peat. Men, women, children, most in the fetal position, positioned exactly as they had been placed by the people who buried them. Deliberate, consistent, repeated, across every square foot of that marsh floor. When the full count was done, 168 individuals. And when dating tests were run on the burial ground itself, the result was staggering. This site had been in continuous use for 1,300 years. Not a single event, not a catastrophe or a mass death. This was a cemetery, a community returning their dead to this specific pond, generation after generation, for longer than the entire span of recorded European history. They weren't just passing through, they were coming back. This is the moment to subscribe if you haven't, because what researchers found next, when they looked inside those skulls, is the part of this story that most people will never hear. Hit subscribe and keep watching, because the DNA result alone will change the way you see prehistoric America. The bog. The first question every scientist asks when confronted with remains this old is the same one. Why are they still here? Bone is organic. In most environments, an 8,000-year-old skeleton leaves nothing behind. The Florida heat alone should have accelerated decomposition beyond any recovery. And yet, forensic specialists who examined the Windover remains describe them as looking like people who had died within the last few years. Here is why, and it matters for what comes next. The pond was a peat bog. Peat is decomposed vegetation, compressed over centuries into a dense, oxygen-poor medium that actively resists the fungi and bacteria responsible for decay. The bodies went in quickly after death, sealed in an anaerobic environment before decomposition could take hold. That alone would have slowed things considerably. But Windover had a second factor that sets it apart from nearly every other bog site on Earth. The peat chemistry was non-acidic. Most bogs are acidic enough to destroy bone over long periods. That is why bog bodies in Denmark and Ireland often retain soft tissue while the skeleton dissolves. At Windover, the chemistry preserved both. If these individuals had been buried in ordinary dry earth, their bones would have been gone within a century or two. The bog had done something no deliberate preservation effort of that era could have achieved. It had held them intact for 80 centuries, which is what made what researchers found inside the skulls so completely impossible to anticipate. The brains. Several skulls were far heavier than they should have been. Not dramatically, just wrong. The kind of wrong that makes you stop and check again. Bone alone doesn't produce that weight. Something was inside. When researchers looked into the cranial cavity, they found a pale, compacted mass sitting exactly where the brain had once been. Working assumption, peat intrusion, organic sediment filtering in over millennia, solidifying inside the skull. Reasonable, logical, wrong. One skull, belonging to a woman estimated to be around 45 years old at death, was transported to the University of Florida for MRI imaging. The scan removed all ambiguity. The mass was not peat, it had structure, defined biological structure. When researchers carefully extracted it, the lab went silent. They were looking at a human brain reduced to roughly a quarter of its original size, compressed by millennia of waterlogged pressure, but unmistakable. The folds present, the architecture intact, the cellular structure visible under a microscope. 8,000 years old. 91 brains were eventually recovered from Windover. Not traces, not impressions, the actual organs in which 8,000-year-old thoughts had formed. And here is the thing that should unsettle you. Homo sapiens has not changed neurologically in 150,000 years. The brain on that lab table was not a primitive organ. It was structurally identical to the brain of the scientists examining it. Whatever these people felt, feared, loved, or grieved, they processed it with exactly the same cognitive hardware we use today. The bog hadn't just preserved their bodies, it had preserved the evidence of their minds. And locked inside that evidence was something geneticist Bill Houseworth, associate professor at the University of Florida, was about to spend months trying to extract. The DNA Houseworth had a specific thought when he heard about the brain tissue. If the cellular architecture had held together across 8,000 years in waterlogged sediment, there was a remote possibility. Unprecedented, unlikely, the kind of long shot you only try because no one has tried it before, that something was still inside those cells. DNA degrades. Heat, moisture, Microbial activity, time, all of it works against preservation. The Sahara had resisted ancient DNA extraction for decades. Florida was warmer, wetter, and by every conventional measure, worse. Nobody seriously expected this to work. Houseworth's team mixed samples of ancient brain tissue with enzymes designed to break down cellular material and release any genetic content still locked inside. Precise cycles of cooling and agitation, months of careful, systematic work. The results came back. Positive. Let that land for a second. Human DNA. Not contamination from surrounding vegetation. Not environmental material from the peat. Human genetic sequences extracted from brain tissue sitting at the bottom of a Florida bog since 3,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids were built. Houseworth knew the contamination problem immediately. It is the fault line every ancient DNA result falls into. Modern human DNA from researchers handling specimens can produce false positives. The sequences look human because they are human, just not the human being studied. He mapped the Windover sequences against known genetic profiles across ethnic populations worldwide. The DNA was distinctly Native American in type, specific markers that distinguish it cleanly from European, African, and Asian profiles. Since no Native Americans had handled or processed the specimens, modern contamination was ruled out with confidence. The oldest confirmed human genetic material ever extracted anywhere on Earth at that time. But that wasn't the strange part yet. The strange part was what happened when Houseworth ran the sequences not just from one individual, but across the full 1,300-year span of the burial site. The face. Before we get to what Houseworth found, you need to see who he was looking at. The DNA sequences told researchers exactly what the Windover people looked like. Dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin, a physical profile consistent in every detail with modern Native American populations. These were not a mysterious lost race, not a vanished civilization with no connection to the people who came after them. They were the ancestors. The genetic signature in those 8,000-year-old brains is the same signature running through indigenous American populations today. Not a footnote to their story. The foundation of it. One individual was selected for facial reconstruction, a woman approximately 70 years old at death. One of the oldest people recovered from the site. Her skull was scanned and converted into a three-dimensional model, with tissue depth data drawn from the DNA profile to guide reconstruction of her face. Glenn Dorn had spent 2 decades studying this woman's remains. He knew her bone density, her dental wear, the healed fractures in her skeleton that told pieces of a life story without names. He knew her age at death, her physical history, the care she had been given by the community around her. He had never seen her face. He watched the reconstruction emerge on a screen in real time, the software layering tissue depth, applying features guided by the DNA profile, building outward from the bone architecture he had spent 20 years handling. Dark skin, dark eyes, the bone structure of a Native American elder rendered with forensic precision. When the process completed and the face held still on the screen fully formed, Dorn was quiet for a long moment, not processing data, just looking. 8,000 years collapsed into a single image on a monitor in a university lab. She looked back at a world that had spent 20 years not knowing she existed. That image, her face, that pause, is the emotional center of everything that follows. That reaction, Doran's silence, that specific pause, tells you something the data alone cannot. This was not an academic exercise. These were people, and what Houseworth's full genetic comparison was about to reveal would make that fact considerably more complicated. The society. The bones don't tell the story you expect. The phrase Stone Age hunter-gatherer comes loaded. Marginal existence, scarcity, survival at the edge. That is not what the Windover skeletal record describes. Some of the men stood nearly 6 feet tall. Bone density across the population indicated robust physical health. Central Florida 8,000 years ago was extraordinarily well-resourced. Rivers dense with fish, forests dense with game, coastline within reach for protein year-round. The best, land was feeding them well. The bones showed it. Researchers at the Smithsonian Institution ran radioisotopic analysis, measuring stable isotopes of hydrogen preserved in the bones, a chemical fingerprint that reflects the water a person drank during their lifetime. Water chemistry varies by geography. Drink from one source long enough, and it embeds permanently in your skeleton. Here is the critical detail. The team also recovered animal bones from local species that died in the bog during the same period. When the hydrogen isotopes of the humans were compared against those of the animals, they didn't match. Not even close. The animals reflected the local water. The humans didn't. These people weren't living beside the bog. They were ranging across the Florida peninsula, moving seasonally, drinking from different water sources across a wide geographic area. Windover was not their home. It was their cemetery, and they were traveling back to it deliberately, sometimes across considerable distances, to bury their dead in this specific water. That tells you something about belief, about what this pond meant to them, about the invisible architecture of a society that left no cities, no monuments, no written record, only this water and the dead. They kept returning to it. The grave goods confirm it. Jewelry, ornaments, weapons, positioned alongside bodies with clear intention. They were equipping their dead for what came next. The pond was not chosen arbitrarily. It was a threshold. Then come the textiles, and this is the part that stops archaeologists cold. Several skeletons were found wrapped in woven fabric. Conventional understanding held that textile production this far back was simply not possible. Weaving was understood as a product of settled agricultural societies, not nomadic groups on a subtropical peninsula. America's foremost authority on ancient fabric examined the material in person. Twined weave, the oldest fabric ever recovered in the Americas. The wear patterns made it stranger still. Adult burials showed cloth that had been worn before death, garments from life carried into the grave. Infant burials showed fabric with almost no wear at all, made specifically for the burial ceremony. Someone wove new cloth for a child's funeral. Think about what that means. And then there is the boy, a teenager, spina bifida, legs paralyzed from an early age. He could not hunt, could not contribute to food supply. And every time this nomadic community moved camp across whatever terrain they were crossing, he had to be physically carried. He lived into his teens. He was cared for across his entire life. And when he died, he received the same deliberate ceremonial burial as every other member of the community. Fetal position, placed in the sacred water, sent into whatever they believed came next, with the same care extended to everyone else. The bog is not recording savagery here. It is recording something considerably more demanding than that. The secret. This is where it gets strange. This is where the title gets paid off. Hauswirth hadn't just run the DNA from one or two individuals. He worked systematically across genetic material recovered from brains spanning the entire 1,300-year lifespan of the burial site, from the earliest burials to the most recent, across 40-some generations of the same community. What he expected to find was variation, drift, the gradual genetic mixing you see in any population that persists across a millennium. New people marrying in, outside bloodlines entering the community, the normal genetic flow of a living society. What he found was the opposite. The sequences were nearly identical across the entire span, generation after generation, century after century. The same genetic signatures, essentially unchanged, returning to the same water to bury their dead. No outside genetic influence entering the population, not across 100 years, not across 500, not across 1,300 years. This is the deeply strange thing. These were nomadic people. The isotope data proved it. They were ranging across the Florida peninsula, drinking from different water sources, covering real distances across a large landscape. They were not isolated by geography. They were not physically cut off from other groups. They chose not to incorporate them. Across more than a millennium of ranging, moving, and seasonal migration, this community remained genetically closed. A dynasty without walls, without a fixed territory, without a city or a fortress, held together by something invisible, a tradition, a lineage, a sense of who they were and who their dead were that persisted intact longer than the Roman Empire lasted. That is what the DNA actually found. Not just ancient genetic material, a closed line across 13 centuries, written in sequences so consistent that the fidelity of the commitment is measurable in the genetic record itself. One pond, one family, 1,300 years of coming back. And inside this community that wove burial cloth for infants and carried its paralyzed across landscapes, there was a murder. The murder grave, 102. A male, late 20s to early 30s, peak physical condition. Alongside his remains, a spear point carved from deer antler. Initial read, a grave offering, a weapon for the afterlife. Standard interpretation. Then the excavation continued, and the spear point was not beside the body. It was inside it, driven into the pelvis, the tip locked in bone with a force that had held it there for 8,000 years. Mike Warren, forensic pathologist, applied the same framework he uses at modern homicide scenes. The trajectory of the wound angled upward from below. That immediately ruled out a ranged throw. A spear in flight follows an arched descent and enters the body from above. This ran the opposite direction. The man was already on the ground when that weapon was driven into him. The wound showed no healing, death time, or very close to it. But it wasn't the fatal injury. No vital structures were hit. Something else had killed him first. Most likely a spear strike between the ribs through soft tissue, leaving no bone trace. He went down from the first blow. The second was deliberate. Then Warren found it. The skull was gone, not displaced by sediment movement. Every surrounding skeleton in the bog was intact. His was not. The top 3 cervical vertebrae, the bones connecting skull directly to spine, were also absent. Warren delivered the finding flatly, the way forensic pathologists do. The fracture evidence indicated a sharp stone tool, repeated cutting, and applied force to complete the separation. He was decapitated. The head was taken. This was not warfare. Florida at this period was too sparsely populated. Warren's conclusion was precise. The violence was personal. A grudge, a territorial conflict, an individual act of lethal anger taken all the way to its end. Inside the same community that carried a paralyzed boy across the landscape and wove new cloth for infant funerals, one man was hunted, killed, and deliberately mutilated. Both things were true. They always are. The full count. Step back and look at the full inventory of what one drained pond in Brevard County produced. 168 individuals preserved across 8,000 years in an environment that should have made preservation impossible. 91 intact human brains, the oldest human DNA ever extracted anywhere on Earth at the time of recovery. The oldest textile ever found in the Americas. A genetic record spanning 1,300 years of continuous family burial. A forensic homicide case reconstructed without a single piece of modern evidence. Each finding alone would be significant. Together, they are not a collection of discoveries. They are a portrait. The Windover people were not a primitive antecedent to something more developed that came later. They were not a rough draft. They were a fully realized society, operating at a level of social and technological sophistication that the existing models of prehistoric America had not predicted and were unprepared to accommodate. They wove complex fabric. They maintained a sacred site across more than a millennium. They cared for their disabled across seasons of migration. They had belief systems elaborate enough to require deliberate grave preparation, long journeys, and formal ceremony. They had conflicts personal enough to end in decapitation. These were modern human beings, living modern human lives, 8,000 years before anyone thought to look for evidence of it in a Florida bog. The open question. Glenn Doran, who has dedicated his career to this site, has said he will probably never encounter anything like it again. He is almost certainly right. But the questions Windover opened are still active. The genetic continuity Hauswirth documented, that closed dynasty, that 1,300-year lineage with no outside influence, represents a population that had been in the Americas long enough to develop a profile, entirely distinct from the Asian populations they ultimately descended from. the crossing from Siberia to Alaska, the isolation on the Beringian land bridge, the southward expansion as the ice retreated, the slow settling into geographic pockets across the continent. All of that had already happened before the first burial went into this pond. These people were already ancient Americans when they started coming here. How far back that lineage extends, and what other communities existed and thrived across the continent during the same period, remains a genuinely open and actively investigated question. Ancient DNA work in hot, humid environments was considered essentially impossible before Windover. A hard scientific consensus, treated as settled. But the same conditions that seemed to make recovery hopeless turned out to preserve the specimens better than Siberian permafrost could preserve the chemistry. The assumptions were wrong. The methods are improving. The databases are still growing. There are almost certainly more sites like this one waiting to be found, sitting in places no one has thought to look yet. Undisturbed for the same reason, no one ever thought to look at a small, black, completely unremarkable pond in Brevard County, Florida. The Windover people did not know they were the last chapter of a 50,000-year story. The man in grave 102 did not know a forensic pathologist would reconstruct his murder 8 millennia later. The teenager with paralyzed legs did not know the people who carried him across a Florida landscape would one day be cited as evidence that prehistoric compassion was as organized and deliberate as any that came after. They were people, specific, particular, irreplaceable people, living inside a society that wove fabric, honored its dead, and kept returning to the same water across more generations than most nations have existed. The bog preserved them, the DNA read them, and the science built on what they revealed is still running. What they revealed was not a primitive world awkwardly preceding our own. It was the same world, running on the same minds, held together by the same impulses. The grief for a dead child that required new cloth, the loyalty to a paralyzed boy that required carrying him, the rage at one man that required taking his head, all of it preserved in peat, all of it 8,000 years old, all of it completely recognizable. We just needed the right pond to see it. If this changed how you think about prehistoric America, subscribe right now, because the next video in this series covers a discovery that makes Windover look like an introduction, and I cannot wait to show it to you. And drop a comment below. What part of this story hit you hardest? The brains? The boy they carried? The genetic dynasty that held for 1,300 years? Tell me, because I want to know which part of this history stopped you cold.